Hey, what's going on everybody? So at first, this was going to be a Bleach durability video exclusively, but as I was writing the script, I realized a breakdown of the entire power system would achieve the same goal and include nuances of the power system that I might not have gotten a chance to mention in an exclusive durability video. So without further ado, this is my comprehensive breakdown of the Bleach Power System. I'm your host Ab-stract and this is the Ab-stract section. Subscribe. Let's get started. To start off, let's get an understanding of Reiatsu and Reiatsu. Reiatsu is spiritual power itself. It's best to think of it like a generator that continuously gives off energy. Reiatsu is the pressure or force emitted from one's spiritual power when externalized. Now, depending on how strong that force is, will determine the different types of effects that spirits experience in battle, but we'll get to that later. It's important to note that simply having a soul or even being a spirit does not grant you spiritual power. We know this is the case because in chapter 59, Kisuke tells Ichigo he is now a regular Konpaku without any spiritual powers whatsoever. So how does one attain spiritual power? Well, there are actually a few ways depending on who we're talking about. But first, let me clarify. Every soul already possesses at least a tiny amount of Reiatsu by default. Regular Konpaku in the Soul Society and living humans all have some baseline spiritual energy. However, for the overwhelming majority, that amount is so minuscule that they can't see spirits, sense Reiatsu, or use any spiritual ability. Awakening spiritual power that is actually usable almost always requires an external trigger that forces that latent Reiatsu to surge and grow. For regular spirits and humans, the most common and fastest method is a genuine life or death situation. Kisuke explains that when a Konpaku is put in a situation where it faces true death, that extreme stress acts as a catalyst to dramatically raise their spiritual power. For humans, they may gain spiritual powers by constantly being in close proximity to those with awakened spiritual abilities. Ichigo's friend Keigo is a prime example of this. Lastly, like Ichigo, Tatsuki serves as a testament to the near-death experience method, as after her encounter with the Hollow, she started to be able to see Ichigo as a Shinigami on a regular basis, far before any of his other friends could. So those are the methods for awakening spiritual power, but what does it actually do for you, and is it something that scales with your stats? I'm glad you asked. Well, we find out in chapters 59 and 60 that attaining spiritual power directly correlates to better stats. Kisuke tells Ichigo that the more your spiritual powers rise, the sharper the movements of your spiritual body will be. This statement confirms for us that their stats are directly linked and affected by the amount of spiritual power they have. Moving on, I stated before that not all souls have awakened spiritual power. Well, the next part of this follows true as well. All beings with awakened spiritual power have Reiatsu, and the stronger your Reiatsu, the greater a Reiatsu you will release. So on top of your stats rising with gaining spiritual power, they are further influenced by the quality and quantity of your Reiatsu. And Bleach makes this very apparent through many fights throughout the series. If we take a look at when Ichigo first fought Renji, it's pretty clear for the majority of the fight, Ichigo was outclassed. But towards the end of the battle, Ichigo's spiritual powers dramatically rise and he is able to easily overwhelm Renji, with Renji stating his spiritual energy is heavy, and that it's not him that's gotten slower, but rather Ichigo has gotten faster. Another example is the restrictive badge that all lieutenant and captain personnel must wear when entering the world of the living. When the badge is worn, we see the Soul Reapers are severely outclassed by the Arrancar as they can only fight with 20% of their actual power. But after the removal of that badge is made, they can now utilize 100% of their spirit energy and all of their abilities rise accordingly. Rangiku can now easily block and blitz Nakim, Renji can overpower Il for a grunt and one-shot him, and Toshido can catch a fleeing Xiaolong Kufeng and one-shot him. Same fighters, same techniques, just 5 times the Reiatsu output, and suddenly they're moving on a completely different level. So yeah, more spiritual power equals higher stats, and being able to release more Reiatsu or a higher quality Reiatsu multiplies those stats even further. Lastly, we'll quickly cover Reiatsu quality. There aren't many concrete ways to compare or quantify Reiatsu quality, but we know it's a thing within the series. People usually like to point to things like Ukiyoda's Reiatsu being described as a vast ocean, or Yamamoto's Reiatsu being called transcendent. And I'm not saying these things aren't instances of higher quality Reiatsu, but I find it more progressive if we can pick out identifying traits and not just the hype of strong spiritual pressure. Starting with Sosuke Aizen, he's the first person who introduced to us a Reiatsu that could not be felt. After subjugating the Hogyoku and almost being killed by Kisuke, Aizen entered his chrysalis stage. From this point on, his power no longer registered to most beings, and despite Kisuke, Yoruichi, and Isshin's efforts to damage him, a disconnect lay between their attacks and any actual damage. In fact, the only thing that did connect was that they were attacking, with Aizen stating that he understood Isshin's attack. almost as if understanding a bad joke and not finding it very funny. I won't be going over Mugetsu here because he reinforces the power not being felt trait, but worry not, we do have an example with Ichigo, and it's shown in his skirmish with Askin. Now, admittedly, this one may be more headcanon, but I think it pans out once explained. So we see Askin asking Ichigo if he underwent some special training from the royal palace. Ichigo confirms this, and Askin concludes this as being the reason he isn't suffering from reishi poisoning. The royal palace training included what? Bathing, fighting, getting new clothes, eating, and Irazu Sando, with Hikifune's ability specifically being to raise one's spiritual pressure through food consumption, and the Irazu Sando strengthening Ichigo as a vessel to hold the power of the three worlds. All these things contributed to Ichigo's power, which undoubtedly affected his Reiatsu, in turn making him immune to Askin's poison. Now again, this is my headcanon for why reishi poisoning didn't work on Ichigo. I could be completely wrong. But anyway, now that we have an understanding of how Reiatsu influences stats, let's cover spiritual combat as it relates to spiritual beings and spiritually aware humans. To this day, Ichigo vs. Kenpachi best illustrates primarily how battles between spirits take place. As said by Kenpachi in chapter 105 and echoed by Aizen in chapter 391, at its most basic level, fights involving spiritual beings are a clash of Reiatsu in where whomever has the stronger Reiatsu will generally be victorious in any given spiritual confrontation. But the reason this isn't an ironclad rule is because so many things can influence a fighter's power output in Bleach. So let's first go over some very clear examples of power clashes in the realm of attack and defense. During chapter 9, Rukia is attacked by some low-level fodder hollow named Shrieker. The hollow is surprised he didn't one-tap her and that she could actually see him. Now, it's important to note that this isn't too long after Rukia had just given all of her powers to Ichigo, so she of course is nowhere near full power, let alone being in a Gigai that stunted the recovery of her power. So after surviving the hollow's attack, Rukia goes for an attack herself, kneeing the hollow in the face, then hitting it with a Kido Blast point blank. Now, to Rukia's surprise, she had enough spiritual power to fire the attack, but the attack is completely no-sold by the hollow, with Rukia remarking she didn't even leave a scratch. She then says she hasn't recovered enough to use that level of Demon Art. The recovery is clearly in reference to her returning spirit power, and the level of Demon Art refers to the output and intensity of the attack she just used. So what she's saying in full context is she hasn't recovered enough of her power to produce a high output attack. And if you thought this was a one-time thing where attacks just bounce off of stronger people, you'd be wrong, because this happens again to Rukia in chapter 44. She attacks a hollow with another Kido and this time says it's only a small fry hollow and that her attacks shouldn't be bouncing off of it. Then for a second time directly ties this phenomena to her lack of strength. Same attacker, same spell type, same result. Why? Because her Reiatsu is still trash even compared to a weak hollow like this one. Her attacks can't penetrate him, but his attacks can still hurt and penetrate her. Another event that takes place in chapter 44 is when Ichigo and Uryu have a contest to see who can destroy more hollows. Now after fighting for a while, Uryu notes that it's getting harder for him to destroy the hollows in a single shot. And it's obviously not because the hollows themselves are getting stronger, rather Uryu's attacks are getting less potent per shot. Fast forward to when the Menos Grande appears, we see Ichigo and Uryu have enough spirit energy to both damage it, but nowhere near significantly enough to cause any meaningful effect. So these are clear examples that even amongst bottom tiers, a disparity in Reiatsu and spiritual power can be the difference between no selling an attack and simply being able to injure your opponent. In these scenarios, Rukia is not mustering even slightly enough power to damage her opponents, whereas Ichigo and Uryu can only slightly injure the Menos Grande. From what Kenpachi and Aizen say, we can attribute all of this to a disparity in spiritual power. Now if you recall, I said whomever has the stronger Reiatsu will generally be victorious in any spiritual confrontation. So let's take a look at the things that can influence a spiritual being's power output. These are resolve, fear, and uncertainty. But we can really just consolidate these into your mental state and emotional state. When Ichigo is training with Kisuke in chapter 66, the reason he cannot call upon Zangetsu is because he is afraid, and rightfully so. Kisuke effortlessly outclasses him in all regards and threatened to kill Ichigo if he attacked him with just the hilt of his sword. But after being centered by Zangetsu and dispelling his fear, he's able to call upon his Zanpakuto and manifest his power. Now let's take a look at Ichigo vs Renji Part 2. Ichigo's issue in this battle wasn't that he was afraid of Renji. The issue was his disposition towards combat, and this is actually a reoccurring theme for Ichigo, as you'll soon see. What Ichigo tends to lack against opponents of similar or greater strength is the mindset to win, void of your winning benefiting anyone other than yourself. What do I mean by this? Well, when he and Renji start fighting, he keeps reaffirming that he's going to save Rukia, and this gets him nowhere. It's not until he resolves within himself that he has to defeat Renji does a dramatic change in him actually show. In this era, it's what we would call locking in, solely focusing on the task in front of you and completing your objective fully. Now, after Ichigo is in this mental state, he is able to one-shot Renji. This highlights just how effective having the right mindset can be compared to just wanting to get something done. Yes, Ichigo wanted to save Rukia, but he first needed to be determined to get past Renji. We even see something similar happen in the Hueco Mundo arc where Grimmjow is questioning if Ichigo really wants to beat him. Initially, Ichigo's stance is he's not trying to crush Grimmjow, but he knows he has to fight him. Again, he's focused on the large picture, saving Orihime, not the immediate task of beating Grimmjow. But Grimmjow slowly walks Ichigo down the inevitable road that leads to a Shinigami in a hollow fighting, where there can only be one person left. So as the fight goes on, Ichigo starts to lock in and solely focus on beating Grimmjow, and he does much better for it. And at the climactic end of this fight with Grimmjow, he reaffirms in order what he must do. He will defeat Grimmjow, Ulquiorra, and Aizen, and then save and rescue all of his friends. So I hope these two instances highlighted just how important mind state and motivation are to a Shinigami's power. Getting back into fear having an effect, during chapter 196, Ichigo is taken by Rukia to fight a regular hollow in the city. But Ichigo can't seem to get himself together. He gets tagged and injured by the hollow and even starts running away from it, despite by this point having fought much stronger people like Kenpachi, Byakuya, and Aizen. So Rukia questions if Ichigo is afraid. If it's the fear of his friends getting hurt, if it's the fear of him not being strong enough, or it's the fear of his inner hollow taking over. But regardless of which one it is, Ichigo is fearful, and because of this, his power suffers. So along with your mental and emotional state playing a part, the other thing that plays a part in your power output is the amount of damage you take and how many attacks you've used so far. Essentially, your stamina meter. Now, while not a very common thing in Bleach, you can run out of spirit energy due to overexhaustion or by simply being drained of your Reiatsu. When it comes to taking too much damage, we can look at chapter 144 and see Renji, who is pretty much on death's door, can't pierce Byakuya with his sword, and in fact loses the ability to maintain his Bankai. During chapter 148, Kaname goes for a backstab on Kenpachi, but due to his waning spiritual pressure because of his injuries, he's unable to even harm Kenpachi despite being able to do so in the beginning of their fight. I think the only time we've seen someone at death's door land a lethal or a critical strike was when Rukia defeated Arenero Arurueri. But this can also be chalked up to the fact that she attacked him in his most vulnerable spot. As far as attacks that get weaker due to low spirit energy, we already covered Uryu and his Eros, Rukia with her Kido. Lastly, Ichigo's full-bring Getsugas are a prime example of this. Jackie states that after firing a certain amount per cycle, she can destroy Ichigo's attack with just a kick because they're too weak. So we finally made it to the durability section of this video. But when we say durability, what exactly are we talking about? I like to define it as the amount of force or pressure one can withstand while showing the least adverse effects to it. And in my video titled The Truth Behind Naruto's Durability, I was extremely thorough, and I intend to be just as thorough covering this portion of my video here. Now, let's first answer the question of, can spiritual beings be hurt by non-spiritual attacks? Like how I did in my Ginmach 500 breakdown, I'll present the evidence for both sides, then tell you guys what I personally believe. Whenever this question is brought up, people always direct us to Chad attacking a hollow. But what they always fail to mention is the hollow was not damaged in the slightest after receiving 2 off-guard attacks from Chad and then smacking it with the telephone pole. But if we keep reading, we do see Rukia fully expect the hollow to be hurt as she tells him to now stay where he is. And it's fair to say she wouldn't say that unless she thought it couldn't move from being injured. So I suppose this could be used as evidence towards non-spiritual damage being applied to spiritual beings. But the thing to consider after that is that Karakura Town is the current Juriki, which means it's a highly concentrated spiritual zone. And with Ginjo going out of his way to mention telephone poles have souls, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that the telephone pole was spiritually charged or anything like that. But the fact that it lies in a high spirit density zone does make an argument for that being the reason why the hollow was injured by it. And I'm doing the quotation marks since you can't see me. Lastly, I don't agree with Chad's full-bring powers as being the reason he was able to damage the hollow. Chad's full-bring powers don't really start to develop until around like chapter 40. This is where he can start to see the outline of a hollow and when he gains his power. So I don't agree with that, but as far as the Juriki and telephone poles having souls, it's a strong argument within the story to say that is the reason why the hollow was hurt by the telephone pole. It would make sense. Next, we can look at Kisuke's training with Ichigo. During the training, Kisuke is comically chasing Ichigo with a sword, but Ichigo has an epiphany and realizes that as a spiritual being, he shouldn't be able to be hurt by anything that isn't spiritual. Now, he says Zanpakuto here, but the translation would be spiritual because hollows at this point don't have Zanpakuto and can still hurt him. So he's talking about spiritual things. Needless to say, Kisuke is able to injure Ichigo and tells him he's naive for thinking his sword wasn't a Zanpakuto. The takeaway from this are 1. Ichigo has been a Soul Reaper for a full month and fully believes only spiritual attacks will work on him. One wouldn't come to this conclusion unless in that entire time they were only hurt by spiritual things. 2. Kisuke doesn't fault Ichigo's logic and reasoning of why he shouldn't be hurt, only his naivety for assuming Kisuke didn't possess the means to actually hurt him. This interaction lends credence to the claim that only spiritual attacks can hurt spiritual beings. Again, Ichigo is fully confident he can't be hurt, and Kisuke doesn't dispel that notion, only the idea that his weapon doesn't meet the criteria. Lastly, there is a comedic scene in chapter 686 where Rukia talks about no human being able to harm her daughter because she is a Shinigami. It is comedic, but that doesn't mean there's no truth to it. So, my opinion on this is twofold. I don't agree physical attacks would work on spirits, and the reason is because I believe it would be counterintuitive to what being a spiritual entity would mean and represent. It wouldn't make any sense for weaker pluses in spirits to be completely unharmed by physical attacks, but stronger ones able to get injured by these same attacks simply because they now have solid spiritual bodies. Mind you, everything that makes up a plus in the human world makes up a Soul Reaper or Hollow. The only difference is they have dense spirit bodies. So that, plus Kisuke and Ichigo's interaction, has me on the side of only spiritual attacks being able to hurt them. On the other hand, I do believe they'd be able to be hurt by impact damage, but allow me to put this into proper context. This form or means of damage is less about the power mechanics and more about how a manga or fight is written and expressed. If you want to show a character was hurt by an attack, or that the attack itself was powerful, writers will often have them crash into things and use their bodies to destroy a lot of the environment. But I don't believe this makes it a two-way street where you can now pick up a rock or a knife and harm Ichigo as a Soul Reaper. With that out of the way, let's move on to spirits and durability. Now, since for spiritual beings, everything is Reiatsu and Reiatsu based, it makes scaling durability from character to character much easier. And since the Gotei 13 has official ranks, classifications, and standards of power to hold position, it adds even more credibility to the scaling as a whole. For example, to be a lieutenant, your spirit powers must be classified at level 6 or higher. So without even getting what 1 through 5 looks like, we know and understand that if someone holds the rank of lieutenant, we can expect their performance to be similar to other Soul Reapers who hold that rank. And I'm not saying it's an absolute and they're stuck at level 6. I'm saying the feats that we see from them or people weaker than them can serve as a baseline for what they as a rank are capable of. Because if people weaker than lieutenants can survive country level attacks, there's no need to see every lieutenant tank a country level attack. We understand that their stats scale with their Reiatsu, and they're all at least class 6. This makes it possible to accurately chain scale characters who don't get as much screen time or have as many feats. With that being said, durability is completely based on your spiritual powers, and this goes from tanking attacks to the life force and vitality of spiritual beings. Let's first cover the latter. Rukia says a Soul Reaper's life force is equivalent to their amount of spirit energy, and she accredits this to why Ichigo was able to survive such grievous wounds from Grand Fisher. Mind you, in this encounter, Grand Fisher impaled Ichigo twice through his chest. Another thing of importance to add is that while life force is tied to spiritual powers, life is not dependent upon having spiritual energy. As we know in the early chapters, Rukia had all of her powers taken by Ichigo, yet this didn't kill her. Yumishika stole all of Shuhei's spirit energy, and this didn't kill him but left him very tired. And in the 1000-Year Blood War anime, Uryu robs Renji of all or nearly all of his spirit energy, yet this doesn't bring him any closer to death, just exhaustion. It's best to think of life force in Bleach as similar to the health system in Super Smash Bros. Brawl when playing on stamina mode. The way it works in the game is that their health is based on damage percentages. Each attack, no matter how fatal it may seem to us, will not destroy them until a certain percentage is reached. Similarly in Bleach, fatal attacks alone are not enough to kill certain characters. The actual damage percentage has to be achieved. For examples of this, we can look at Mayuri having nearly half of his body blown off by Uryu and that not instantly killing him. In fact, he had time to talk shit to Uryu and perform his get out of jail free card. Izuru getting his arm and chest destroyed by Baz B in the beginning of the first invasion and surviving until the end of the first invasion long enough to get healed. We actually see Grimmjow settle a decent portion of Meneli's body off, but Urihime is able to save her, meaning that this didn't instantly kill her. Also, it's important to note that Urihime healed lowly first and not Meneli, meaning that she had to survive long enough to actually be healed. Lastly, we are Shunsui surviving several shots from Lele's X-axis, which puts a hole in anything it hits, and Shunsui himself remarking, he's so damn strong that the wounds he has won't allow him to pass out, much less die. So with those examples, I'm hoping my analogy to Super Smash Bros. Fits more accurately. While spiritual beings can likely be instantly killed from something like losing their heads, oh wait, Lele survived that too. Anything aside from total destruction is on the table of being survived, depending on how strong the individual is. Even bisecting Yamamoto in half was not enough to outright kill him. Now, getting into durability and how it's handled. The best way to find out how durable someone is to take an attack that costs some type of damage and see how that character did against that attack. Obviously, right? But sadly, not every attack has a damage value for whatever reason, or the destruction shown is lower than what that character would actually scale to. Take Ichigo's Getsuga Tenshos for example. The first showing we're given is that it can vaporize this rock structure behind Kisuke. But fast forward to the fake Karakura Town arc, and we see Holified Bankai Ichigo's Getsuga Tensho not even decisively destroy this building. But we do see it have an impact on Aizen. Now, if you didn't know how to power scale, you wouldn't be crazy for thinking the attack cut the building in half and it hurt Aizen, therefore Aizen is some X amount higher than building level. I wouldn't fault you for this. But understanding how scaling AP works tells us that the damage that Ichigo did do to Aizen is much more impressive than anything he's demonstrated so far, save for his Vasto Lode performance. So the question we need to ask ourselves is why was Aizen able to only be mildly wounded from a Getsuga Tensho while off guard, while other people got one-shotted in the case of Renji, had their body burned and scarred in the case of Grimmjow, and got completely overpowered by a Holified Getsuga in the case of base Ulquiorra? Well, the answer is no secret. Aizen has a shit ton of Reiatsu. This allows him to mitigate the adverse effects from people using weaker or less Reiatsu, and that's it in a nutshell. In fact, a similar thing happened to Ichigo when he attempted to use Getsuga Tensho on Ulquiorra in his first release, except instead of doing minor damage, Ichigo did no damage. Another example is when Candace shot a basic Hylic file at Ichigo, it had no effect on him at all, in fact he was smiling. If the attack is severely lacking in more spiritual power than the opponent is either passively or actively giving off, they can elect to just tank your attack outright while showing the least adverse effects to it. And the best way to determine cross-verse how this would work would be getting the AP of, let's say, a Rasengan, and comparing that to the AP with a similar attack in Bleach. If the attack is tanked, no sold, or shows to do very little in Bleach based on its AP, we can conclude a similar result would happen with the cross-verse attack containing the same AP.
Well, hold up, Ab-stract. If it's just having a lot more Reiatsu allows you to not be hurt by attacks, then why don't people like Aizen, Yam, and Ichigo just tank every attack?
Well, in some cases they do, and in some cases they don't. You see, the reason you probably wouldn't want to do this on a consistent basis is because it would likely exhaust you faster. Let's jump to when Aizen was bullying everyone on Sokyoku Hill. We see him barehandedly stop Renji's Shikai, which can move Ichigo, whom couldn't be moved an inch by Jidamo's axe swings. We then see Aizen iconically cut off Ichigo's theme music and stop his Zanpakuto with a single finger. And lastly, Aizen embarrasses Captain Komamura by catching his sword and one-shotting him. But I believe Aizen only did all this because it was the right group of people. Had it been high captain class fighters, he wouldn't have been so confident as to catch their blades. People like Yamamoto, Unohana, and likely Shunsui output more Reiatsu than Aizen would be willing to trade for. Remember, everything comes down to a clash of Reiatsu, and just because Aizen can easily stop their blades doesn't mean he's not expending power doing so. That just about wraps it up for spiritual beings, so let's talk about spiritually aware humans. It should go without saying that humans can be hurt by both physical things and spiritual things. This goes from basic human attacks like punches and kicks to Zanpakuto, Kido, Hakuda, Setos, you name it. The Reishi world, in all facets, has no problem imposing on the Kishi world. Now, we've already covered that pretty much everything comes down to a battle of Reiatsu, and just like Uryu, Fullbringers and the other Quincy are no different. They have to play by the same rules the spirits do, i.e., if your attack does not have enough Reiatsu behind it, you will scarcely do significant damage. So, Tsukishima injuring Byakuya, even though we've never seen him fight, means he's exerting enough Reiatsu to do so. And the same can be said for Kuko Ginjo when fighting Ichigo. One person who was severely lacking in power, even after getting Ichigo's power imparted onto her, was Yaki Tristan. Due to the gap in spiritual power between her and Renji, she couldn't injure him at all and got one-shotted. So, the only person this is an exception for is Mo Shishigawara, whom relies entirely on his jackpot knuckles probability manipulation in order to cause damage. And that's pretty much it. Human beings have to follow the same rules and logic of the power system in order to fight against spiritual beings. Now let's get into life force and vitality, and lastly, durability. As far as vitality, spiritually aware humans like Fullbringers and Quincy don't have their life force tied to their spirit energy, but it can be used as an indicator of their life force. There are plenty of examples in the story like Ginjo sensing Tsukishima's impending death, or when Ichigo was sensing Chad was nearly killed by Shunsui. Although in that instance Chad had a Reishi body, but you get the point. From what I found, their life force is tied to their physical bodies and requires all the necessary parts to function. In fact, when Ichigo is training with Jackie, she scolds him for taking so many of her attacks and reminds him that he could die because he's no longer in a Shinigami body. So spiritually aware humans have to be cognizant of the damage they take and to what degree they've been damaged, or they can bleed to death like Tsukishima or succumb to their injuries like Ginjo did. When it comes to their physical durability, spiritually aware humans are awarded the same benefit that Reiatsu grants to spiritual beings when fighting spiritual beings or interacting with spiritual phenomena. and this gets even more prevalent when we talk about the Stern Ritter, who all drink Yuha's blood and gain the power up from that. The only difference for spiritually aware humans is, as I said before, they can be injured by physical attacks because they have physical bodies. So while having awakened Reiatsu should make them stronger, having Reiatsu should not offer inherent protection against physical attacks. So what minimum durability are spiritual beings and spiritually aware humans? Well, the question is actually convoluted because, if you've been paying attention, Bleach has power classifications, so it would be more appropriate to ask what minimum durability can we expect from each tier of fighter, that being 3rd C, Lieutenant, Captain, etc, etc. Starting with spiritual beings, the weakest person who survives a decent attack from an enemy is Ikkaku during the Arrancar arc. Now, Ikkaku can actually be treated like a lieutenant despite not having the rank because he's shown to stalemate lieutenants like Tetsuzaimon in combat, and Yumishika, who he should be stronger than, can defeat Shuhei, another lieutenant. I'll use the same feat that I did for my Kakashi vs Toshiro video. So, the feat in question is this cratering via vaporization from Eterad. The count that I did had the total energy coming in around this much energy here, or approximately 57 kilotons of TNT, with the AP in at this much energy here, which would come in at city block level. So with Ikkaku surviving this, we can expect other spiritual beings of similar power to be able to do so as well. For Captain class fighters around this arc, I think using Grimmjow's feat of destroying this giant pillar with the AoE of a bullet will be sufficient enough. So remember when I said some feats make calc lower but scale higher? This is a prime example of that. As I laid out in my Kakashi vs Toshiro video, Grimmjow is several orders of magnitudes above Eterard, given that between them lie the Pre-Verona Espada and 3 weaker Espada, all whom have a 5x amp with Resurrection. But the problem is, Eterard's attack has similar AP and eclipses Grimmjow's attack in total energy. Well, this is where the scaling would come into the phrase of power scaling. Being that we know Eterard is weaker, he can't logically perform an attack more powerful than Grimmjow, despite Grimmjow's attack calcing less impressive. So what we do in scenarios like this is apply the total energy of the higher calced attack to the higher scaled attack with a much smaller volume and find AP the usual way. I'll say that again. We take the higher calced attack and apply the total energy to the higher scaled attack while factoring in the AoE. And we do this because the stronger character at a bare minimum must be exerting no less force than the weaker character. In this way, we have a reference for where we're getting our numbers, we're still lowballing, and we're maintaining accuracy. So if we take Eterard's attack of 57 kilotons of TNT, which would be a town level plus attack, and spread it across the AoE of Grimmjow's attack, we would get this number right here, or small town level AP. Now, being that a majority of the captains fought stronger Espada and either stalemated them or defeated them, and the rest of the captains easily dispatched the other Espada, they could be scaled at the very least the Grimmjow's level of power, though likely higher. So around this time in the series, I would have the lieutenants at city block level AP and captains at small town level AP. Now, if this seems too low to you, I definitely get it, but understand my scaling focuses on low balls and necessary minimums to achieve a higher degree of accurate scaling. As with anything, they could be much higher, but I can prove through feats, scaling, and calcs that they're at least this much. When it comes to humans, they would be able to handle Reiatsu-based attacks up to the people that they've been shown to scale 2 or above. For example, Tsukishima fighting on par with Byakuya massively outscales Eterard's whole existence, and thus, he would be able to survive Reiatsu-based attacks of his level and anyone weaker than Byakuya at that point. When it comes to humans being hurt by physical things, this is a little more tricky because there honestly isn't enough information to pull from. Ichigo is able to endure Jackie's full-bring attacks, but I have no idea where she scales in terms of physical damage, which if you haven't noticed would be different than her spiritual attacks. She doesn't display a calculable feat until her fight with Renji, and by that point she already had Ichigo's power. So it's kinda hard to determine how physically durable spiritually aware humans are. The only thing I could really find was Ichigo being kicked into this building by Tsukishima and Ginjo saying no human would be okay after a fall from that height. So suffice to say, Ichigo's human body, much like his friend Naruto, is building level. Yep, you can drop them both off at the Grand Canyon and neither one of them are coming back. Nah, just kidding. I'd need a little bit more data points for that, but hey, that's what we're working for right now. Let's end the video off on some good scaling. We have Eterard's attack at city block level AP, which Ikkaku survived. At full power, Ichigo was able to one-shot Dordoni, a Pre-Verona Espada who would scale above Eterard, meaning Ichigo at full power is a blitz and one-shot tier above city block level fighters, but I'm not done yet. Ichigo gets stronger without the course of Mundo becoming so powerful that he can fully block Grimmjow's Gran Resetto with no damage. Assuming the Gran Resetto carries 10 times the total energy of Eterard's attack, every cubic centimeter of the Gran Resetto would actually be trash. Calculating this has it coming out to around wall level AP due to how massive the Gran Resetto is, but we know due to scaling, the Gran Resetto should at minimum be carrying equal or higher AP than what Eterard can do. So, on the JCC basis, the AP would actually be multi-city block level. Ichigo took the entirety of Grimmjow's Gran Resetto and was more or less unaffected by it, meaning multi-city block damage isn't even enough to face Ichigo at full power. I'm your host, Ab-stract, and this was the Ab-stract section. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We out.